EMSB?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, we're here. How do I get rid of this thing? Hello? Hello? Okay, so we're going to go back to, while Renee is trying to find the IEP, we were about to talk about supplementary aids and services, program modifications and supports. This is a really key part of the IEP, and I think sometimes parents aren't fully aware of the power of this section of the IEP. So when your child has any kind of needs, as you're thinking about what really individualizes your child's program, it's the programmatic modifications and supports and the supplementary aids and services that will really really individualize the program. So when we talked before about, you know, does your child love the Power Rangers or hate being touched on the shoulder, or, you know, are fluorescent lights a problem, or does your child respond to loud voices a certain way? Those things can all be captured in the supplementary aids and services. Fluorescent lights can be covered, and so in the modifications to the classroom, you might want to say, you know, that the fluorescent lights will have covers on them to blunt the light. Sometimes people get tennis balls on chairs to make the chairs move more easily and to cut down on the noise. Sometimes children need to rest during the day. They need breaks. You know, things like this sort of standard things like graphic organizers and extra time can certainly be on the list. And there's a list of instructional supports, but there shouldn't be a laundry list of things in it. And all the supplementary aids and services should be coming from what your child actually needs. There's any list that you see is not all inclusive. So it should be very personalized. The supplementary aids and services are the things that your child needs. The programmatic modifications and supports are the things that school staff need to better support your child. So things like staff training. If you have a child who's got an unusual disability, or who needs, you know, has seizures, and the staff need training about seizures, or they need training about how to administer your child's medicine, the nurse does, or your child takes medicine, the medicine administration should be listed here. Whatever the services are, this is the place where those services should be captured. If your child needs additional staffing, it would be captured here. So some of the supplementary aids and services pages that go on and on and on. There are lots and lots of services captured, but you want something more than just, you know, extra time and information chunked and preferential seating. And if you see preferential seating, what does that even mean? Does that mean your child's going to be at the front of the classroom, at the back of the classroom, not sitting next to anybody because your child needs extra space? The key to the IEP is it has to be detailed enough that somebody should be able to pick it up and understand what it means. They should be able to read every provision and know how to implement it and have a sense of who your child is. One of the things that I often say at meetings is when I run into situations where a team says, "Oh, we don't need to put it on the IEP because we do it. Everybody here knows the child. We know what we're doing. We don't need to capture it on the IEP." I will come back and say, "Well, okay, but if you all you all chip in and you buy lottery tickets. You chip in and you want to win that Powerball $1.6 billion, and you win, and you all move to Tahiti, and a new group of people come in, and they pick up the IEP. They're not going to know what to do unless it's in writing. They're not going to know what's in your heads as you're implementing the IEP. So it's not, it's not an issue of trust. I try and come into IEP meetings and assume that team members want to do the right thing and that they have the best interest of the child at heart. But it's an issue of what happens if those staff people aren't there? What happens when the teacher is absent? What happens if the aides move on? And what happens if the therapist goes out on maternity leave? You need to have an IEP that is a self-standing document. And I think that's the key as you come into this process. It's not to come in and say, I don't trust you. I don't think you're going to do the right thing. You need to put this in writing. It needs to be in writing because that's what the law requires, and it needs to be in writing in case you're not there. Anybody should be able to walk in, pick up this IEP, and understand what to do with it. And if they can't, then it's not a document that's going to be useful.
Okay. I just want to make, if you guys can let us know that you can hear us. I just want to make sure. Okay, I just heard something, but I just want to make sure that we're recording and everyone can see what we're doing here and hear us.
We can see, we can hear, but we cannot see.
Can you see the IEP?
Nothing. All we see is a little white icon. It's completely blank.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, there's something here that, okay, there's 5 chats. Let's see what's happening.
Okay. Okay, well, while Renee is trying to figure that out, I'm going to start talking about goals and objectives. As you are moving on to the goals and objectives, you want goals that are ambitious, and they have to be in.
You good now? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on, which I think we're going to goals and objectives next.
My pages.
Keep going.
Oh, are we?
Keep going. Oh, okay. So before we get to goals and objectives, extended school year service. So a lot of the IEP development happens before you ever get to your goals and objectives. It's an odd order that the state online IEP goes in. But extended school year services are, as I'm sure you all know, the services that go beyond the regular school year. If your child needs services in order to continue to make educational progress, not to make more progress, but if your child's progress during the upcoming school year would be jeopardized without services during the summer, then your child is entitled to extended school year. And in making that decision, the team looks at, does the IEP include goals that are, excuse me, related to critical life skills? And critical life skills are both academic and functional. The team looks at whether there's a likely chance of substantial regression of critical life skills, and whether there'd be a failure to recover those skills in a reasonable time. So that's regression and recoupment of skills. The team looks at whether the student is demonstrating a degree of progress towards the mastery of IEP goals. So if that mastery would be interrupted without services, is there a presence of emerging skills or breakthrough opportunities? Are there significant interfering behaviors? does the nature and the severity of the disability warrant ESY? And are there any other special circumstances? So the team looked at all of those questions, and the team has to look at each of those questions individually. So only one of those needs a yes answer to justify extended school year services. So if the team says that, yes, the child's ability to benefit from education during the school year would be jeopardized without extended school year services, then the team would be student eligible. One of the things that that comes up all the time is that most districts have a kind of one-size-fits-all 4 or 5 week program that they call their ESY program. And it's generally, 4 or 5 hours or 3 hours, and they find a child eligible, and that's what they provide, and that's what the child gets. And then the child's generally home in August, and the child's generally home between the end of the school year and the beginning of ESY. There are children who need services beyond that. The decision for ESY should be an individualized determination. And there may be children who also need services during any school break, because any time that they're without services, they regress, or it takes them a long time to recoup skills. So it's important as you think about this, and data are really key in justifying the decision to provide or not provide extended school year services. The team should always be collecting data. When we talk about goals and objectives, we'll talk about how those goals should be measurable and data should be collected. So it might be that during winter break, data are collected, and when a child comes back in January, there's been regression, and it takes a while to recoup the skills that were lost, or the child comes back and has significant behavior issues. That may justify extended school year services, but it also may justify services beyond the standard program the school system offers, and the child may need additional services to bridge that gap between the end of the standard program and the beginning of the upcoming school year. And the school system will have to figure out what to do. So I've had kids who have gotten tutoring. I've had kids who have gotten applied behavior analysis services. It's really it should be an individualized decision, and it should also be a decision based on least restrictive environment provisions of the law. So there are kids who may get their extended school year services provided in a camp setting or in another setting where there are kids without disabilities, because for those kids, the social opportunities with non-disabled peers might be the services that they need in order to continue to make progress during the upcoming school year. It should be such an individualized decision. Okay. So for kids who are 14 or younger, if it's appropriate.
Hi, dear.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm just looking at a webinar. Yes.
Okay. So if you don't
absolutely.
if you can put your phone on mute, that would be,
Yeah.
that would be helpful.
Okay, it's no worries. Thank you. Okay.
If anybody listening
Indeed.
could people listening please put their phones on mute, unless you have a question. And if you have a question, please use the chat box, and we'll leave time for questions. Okay, so for students beginning at age 14 in Maryland, federal law begins transition at 16, and Maryland begins at 14 or younger if it's appropriate. Transition planning begins. So it's important that students have a big role in their transition. Their interests, their preferences are assessed, and they have a right to attend their IEP meetings and to participate. So post-secondary goals will be identified for them. Their course of study becomes important, and they will exit, with a diploma, with a certificate. As they get older, it will be important to figure out which that will be. But we want to make sure, again, that the decision is not made too early. We don't want kids taken off the diploma track too early, and we want them to have all options open to them and their projected date of exit. So under federal and state law, students have the right to special education through the school year in which they turn 21. Now, if they meet all the graduation requirements, they certainly can leave sooner. For anybody who is likely to be getting services through the Developmental Disabilities Administration, staying until 21 and taking advantage of transitioning youth services, youth funding would certainly make a lot of sense.
So you would suggest maybe extending,
To 21.
not getting the credits right away and kind of spreading it out a little bit.
So for students who are going to get diplomas, the likelihood is they're not going to qualify for services from DDA.
Right.
But for students who have significant developmental disabilities who are going to get DDA services, who are generally the students on the certificate path,
right,
it would make sense to stay till they're 21 and then move into DDA programming, whatever that looks like, and get the transition funds. Okay, so there's a lot to say. We could do a whole webinar in transition, but we're gonna keep moving. And yeah, we're gonna keep moving. So another important point for transition is that all the agencies that are likely to be needed for the student and involved with the student need to be at the table. They need to be invited to be at the table. And really important to know about transition is that it is meant to be a coordinated set of activities. It is not just, throw something on the paper and say that kid wants to be a professional football player. That's not enough, right? It may be what the student wants to do, but then how do you take that and turn that into a potential job? Maybe there's a job at the stadium. Maybe the student can have recreational activities involving sports and have a job that's related to sport. Maybe the student could work at a gym and have access to the gym. There are all sorts of possibilities you could take based on the student's interests, but most people without disabilities don't become professional football players either. So how do you take the student's interests and figure out what makes sense? And how do you coordinate with the other agencies? If a student has assistive technology, and it's a school-owned device, how will that technology follow the student when the student leaves the school system? And planning ahead, that planning is important. So transition is how do you get from here, student in school, to there, student after school, and you start at 14 earlier if it's appropriate, and you've got those years to plan, and every year should be building on the year before, and so that it's a smooth move from the school system to post school. Okay, so then we finally, on page 25 of this document, get to goals and objectives. So under the Supreme Court ruling in the Andrew F. case that came out, we know that the requirement is that goals be appropriately ambitious, that we know that goals have to be measurable, and we have objectives that help students to reach the goals. So there should be goals in every area in which the student has a need, and the objectives should be linked to those goals. Not every goal that's measurable makes sense. One of the classic examples I always give is that I once had a child who was visually impaired, and the team developed a goal that said she would avoid obstacles in her path on 3 out of 4 occasions with 75% accuracy. And my question to the team was, well, what if the obstacle in her path is a car? She kind of needs to do this with 100% accuracy on every occasion, because if the obstacle in her path is a car, she may not get another chance to try that, right? It's measurable, but it doesn't make sense. So don't be taken in just because you see a percentage, or just because you see 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 times. You need to look at the goal, and you need to look at whether it actually makes sense for your child. Sometimes you just see a goal that says, Renee will increase her reading level over baseline. Well, what does that mean? What's the baseline and how much is she going to increase her reading? Or, Renee will learn 2 new vocabulary words. Well, that's probably, she'll never learn enough vocabulary words to be able to read anything if the goal is 2 vocabulary words a year. So what you want to do is find a balance between being challenging and not overwhelming the child. The law does not require that children maximize their potential, but we know that the standard for that the expectations are high. We know from the Every Student Succeeds Act and from the No Child Left Behind Act before that expectations for all children have risen. And all children means all children with disabilities as well. And the Andrew F. Supreme Court case has made pretty clear that kids with disabilities, the expectations are high for them as well. So when you're looking at annual goals, you should be looking at what are kids without disabilities doing, and what's the expectation for them, what does the general education curriculum look like, and then tying the goals and objectives to the general ed curriculum. Even for kids with significant disabilities, the curriculum who are using alternate achievement standards, the curriculum still should be tied to the general curriculum. It should still have a relationship to it. And the expectations are still high for community readiness and career readiness, even if they're kids who are not going on to college, as many kids with disabilities can. And the expectation is career and college readiness for everybody, with the understanding that there are kids whose disabilities are so significant that that's not going to be possible, but the expectations are still high, and the goals and objectives should be challenging, and kids shouldn't be relegated to, the traditional sheltered workshop, low expectations. So progress has to be measured. The goals and objectives should be measurable. How progress will be measured should be defined on the IEP. And it's really not enough to get an IEP progress report that just says child's making sufficient progress to meet the goal. A lot of times parents get making progress, child hasn't made any progress, the team needs to meet to review the IEP. What you want a recorder is something that actually tells you how your child is doing. And that's the purpose of the data collection. So if you're not getting that, you can ask for a meeting with a team. You can ask to sit down with a teacher. You can ask for the data and find out, how is your child doing in terms of making progress towards the goal. What are the numbers behind the summary statement that you may be getting? Maybe you are getting data, and if you are, that's terrific. Most of the progress reports we see are pretty summary. So so you can certainly ask for the data behind the summary statements. And the team is required to meet if your child is not making progress towards the goal. So then the services page, the team has to specify the services that will be provided, the special education, any related services. Related services are the services that help your child benefit from special education, orientation and mobility, speech and language, occupational therapy, physical therapy. There's a whole list in the law, and then the amount of time that your child will get service. It can be direct service. It can be consultative, where the service provider works with the classroom staff, and that generally is reflected in the supplementary aids and services page of the IEP, there are related services that are often not typically on an IEP, but certainly can be. They're in the law. Recreational services, music therapy, art therapy are all, possible services. Nursing services, if your child has a health condition and needs services either from the school nurse or one-to-one nursing services can be provided if needed. Transportation is a related service. So those are all services that should be reflected on the IEP. Travel training, as we talked about. Travel training is different from orientation and mobility. Travel training would teach your child how to navigate around, use a bus, use public transportation. If your child is going to use paratransit, that could teach your child to use that. Uber, maybe not for students traveling alone, or possibly. I think it would depend on the child's disability and how independent they are. I mean, for older children, possibly. And that actually raises, so in transition planning and math, I often see counting money as a math goal, and I often raise a question about that, because how many of us are really using nickels and dimes and quarters and pennies anymore, right? We're using debit cards, we're using ATM cards, we're a lot of what we're doing with money is electronic, and people are using Venmo, although I'm not, but lots of people are not using money, and they're certainly not using coins. So when you say Uber, you pay for Uber with a credit card. And so as you're thinking about independence for older students, it's really important to think about transition goals that are going to help students function in the world in which they live. And teaching students how to use debit cards, how to use Uber, how to manage in a world that is so technology based is really key. And spending oodles of time having them distinguish between a penny and a nickel may not be a functional goal. So when we go back to the IEP requiring instructional and academic and functional skills, think about what is functional for kids in 2018, 2019, as we as we're heading into 2019. What's functional now? Because what's functional now is not what was functional 5-10 years ago.
It changes.
It changes all the time.
My daughter's going to be 21, and she does have a debit card. She does need assistance depending on, sometimes she can find it. It's a different set of every store has a different kind of sequence. She needs someone to tell her what screen is popping up, and so I wish there was an audio. It's right over here.
Okay, so then we come to placement. The team is required to make a decision based on the law requires least restrictive environment, and there is a presumption that students will be placed in their neighborhood school, the school that they would attend if they did not have a disability. There is not a requirement that a child be placed and fail before moving on to something else. There is also not, this is not a black and white, you go into general ed and you're in there full time, or you go into a self-contained program and you're in there full time. Kids can move flexibly. So some kids may spend some of their time in general ed and some of their time in a self-contained program, or they may spend all of their time in one or all of their time in the other. And there's not, there's no reason why a child who is in a self-contained program should only be included for specials, for art and music and gym. Maybe that child should be included for academics that they're strong in, or for science, or, this is where the individual needs of the child need to govern. But the law requires that they be in the least restrictive environment and requires the team to justify the removal from general education. There is a very strong presumption. And even if a child needs intensive special education services, lots of related services, lots of supplementary aids and services, there's no reason why those cannot be provided in a general education classroom. So it is illegal for a team to make decisions based on the configuration of the service delivery system, or at administrative convenience, or the nature or the severity of the child's disability. But only if the child's needs cannot be met satisfactorily, even with the use of supplementary aids and services, can the team move on to progressively more restrictive placement options. And so those range from general ed to sometime in both, to self-contained, to a separate special education school, to ultimately residential and home and hospital teaching. So we'll go on. For an initial IEP, the parent has to consent. For subsequent IEPs, parental consent is not required except for the situations that we talked about earlier, for movement from diploma to certificate, for movement to from the regular assessment to the alternate assessment, any kind of non-credit bearing program, or for restraint or seclusion. And the other thing the team can ask you for is consent to, if your child has Medicaid, the team can ask you to consent to use of Medicaid benefits to pay for some of the medically oriented services your child may get. They cannot not give your child services if you refuse to consent. The one caveat that I would offer is, if your child is getting Medicaid funded services outside of school, be wary about consenting to the use of Medicaid for in-school services, because Medicaid will not cover services twice. They will consider it duplicative. So if you're, for instance, getting physical therapy outside of school, and maybe you're getting horseback therapy, horse hippotherapy outside of school, and then the school wants to tap Medicaid for physical therapy, where you're getting aquatic therapy outside of school, and the school wants to tap your Medicaid benefits for physical therapy, Medicaid will count that as double physical therapy, and they won't cover the hippotherapy. So just be careful if you think you will get services for your child outside of school, that it's not a service the school wants to bill for, because you won't be able to get it paid for. So this would be a good time, I think, to ask if anybody has questions.
Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see. I go in here. Does anyone have any questions?
I was concerned. Am I supposed to type it or say it?
You can talk.
You can talk.
I'm concerned. My son is not cognitively impaired at all, only blind, and he is progressing very well with mobility services. So much so that they're considering stopping services for a short period of time, because it's starting to compromise how much class time he's missing, and he's doing so well that they think that he'll be able to retain what he's using, because he uses it on a daily basis, clearly. But there is going to be a time when he reaches high school that he's going to then need to be able to do more advanced travel skills, which he won't need as a middle schooler right now. If consent to stopping mobility, have you ever seen an issue where they're like, well, he didn't need it before, so he doesn't need it anymore, that they won't bring it back? Is that something that I should maybe just hold on to just for the sake of, and we know we're going to need it in the future, or am I being overprotective there?
So I think that, the decisions about IEP services have to be made anew every year. And the fact that he may not need it now does not mean he's not going to need it in the future. And I think you could potentially ask that the services be bounced to consultative services rather than direct. If he doesn't need direct services right now, you could just ask that the O&M instructor check in on him every 4 months or every 3 months, once a quarter, and make sure that he's maintaining, because if they think that he's going to retain the skills, you want somebody checking to see if he's actually retaining the skills. And I would suggest actually a monthly consult, just to make sure. And then you could always come back to the table if it looks like he's slipping and put the services back on now, in a month or 2 months if he's not retaining. And then when he gets to high school, when he's in a new building and there's new stuff, it can certainly come back on. I think that it should be a flexible service. And the fact that he has it now doesn't mean it's going to stay on the IEP 3 years from now. It's a new decision every year. But so I think you could comfortably, probably, if he's really doing that well, and it's terrific he's doing that well, move it to maybe monthly consult if they would agree, and then reinstate direct services at the point at which he needs them.
Excellent. I like that idea very much. Thank you so much.
Somebody else has a question here. Do the terms visual impairment include visual field deficits or cognitive delays resulting from visual cortex injury?
So the cognitive delay would be a separate disability, I think. There is a definition of visual impairment, and I think that it would include visual field deficits. I don't have the definition in front of me. I know that there's been a federal complaint letter, or a federal ruling by the Office of Special Education Programs, and also a ruling by the State Department of Education that at least some of the school systems in Maryland have been interpreting visual impairment too narrowly. So I think it's a pretty broad definition, and I don't see why it would not include visual field deficit, but I would have to look at the definition again.
They actually consider that for being able to enroll into MSB. They consider there's so much you can't just say legally blind. It's so broad that they do consider the visual field, the depth perception, all of that comes into play when determining if your child qualifies for our school.
And then the question, can you request an IEP meeting anytime you feel it's necessary? Yes, you can request an IEP meeting when you think it's necessary, and you should have a basis for that request. There are some parents who request meetings a lot, and there should be a reason why you're requesting that meeting, other than that you just don't like the decision the team's met and you keep requesting. But if there's a change in your child's situation, if you have new information, if you have some reason for the meeting, then absolutely. So if your child has emerging skills, I'm not sure what this means. Maybe the person who typed this could weigh in.
Can you unmute yourself and just talk to us? The person that sent this question. Michael Jacks.
Oh, okay. So if the question is, can you request an IEP meeting because your child has emerging skills? Absolutely. And you would want the team to know what those skills are, and then you would ask the team to address the skills. Yes, emerging skills which are currently unaddressed. Yeah, you would want the team to address those skills, and you would want to explain why those skills are related to your child's education.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, it looks like that they don't. Thank you for joining us. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is going to be archived on our website. And please keep checking our website for our upcoming webinars. We're going to have another webinar. I'm hoping to have one kind of piggybacking the ideas of this one. And if you ever have any points of interest that are coming up in your child's education or social, emotional well-being, and ideas for a webinar that you'd like to address and a speaker, please let me know. You have my email, yeah, I would definitely like to. And the other thing that we were talking about, we do regional conferences and workshops. So if there's a group of parents in your area that really would love to have a professional come out and help them with different things in their child's life, emotional, social skills, daily living skills, whatever it is, technology, let me know that as well, and maybe we can plan for something in the future. So thanks so much, Leslie.
Oh, thank you.
And again, if you have any questions, just email me. Thank you.